Chapter 30. The Kingdom of Greatness, the Pilgrim a Dream. Whatever a man like Hurstwood could be in Chicago, it is very evident that he would be but an inconspicuous drop in an ocean like New York. In Chicago, whose population still ranged about 500,000, millionaires were not numerous. The rich had not become so conspicuously rich as to drown all moderate incomes in obscurity. The attention of the inhabitants was not so distracted by local celebrities in the dramatic, artistic, social, and religious fields as to shut the well-positioned man from view. In Chicago, the two roads to distinction were politics and trade. In New York, the roads were any one of a half-hundred, and each had been diligently pursued by hundreds, so that celebrities were numerous. The sea was already full of whales. A common fish must needs disappear wholly from view, remain unseen. In other words, Hurstwood was nothing. There is a more subtle result of such a situation as this, which, though not always taken into account, produces the tragedies of the world. The great create an atmosphere which reacts badly upon the small. This atmosphere is easily and quickly felt. Walk among the magnificent residences, the splendid equipages, the gilded shops, restaurants, resorts of all kinds. Scent the flowers, the silks, the wines. Drink of the laughter springing from the soul of luxurious content, of the glances which gleam like light from defiant spears. Feel the quality of the smiles which cut like glistening swords, and of strides born of place, and you shall know of what is the atmosphere of the high and mighty. Little use to argue that of such is not the kingdom of greatness, but so long as the world is attracted by this, and the human heart views this as the one desirable realm which it must attain, so long to that heart will this remain the realm of greatness. So long also will the atmosphere of this realm work its desperate results in the soul of man. It is like a chemical reagent. One day of it, like one drop of the other, will so affect and discolor the views, the aims, the desire of the mind, that it will thereafter remain forever dyed. A day of it to the untried mind is like opium to the untried body. A craving is set up which, if gratified, shall eternally result in dreams and death. Aye, dreams unfulfilled, gnawing, luring, idle phantoms which beckon and lead, until death and dissolution dissolve their power and restore us blind to nature's heart. A man of Hurstwood's age and temperament is not subject to the illusions and burning desires of youth, but neither has he the strength of hope which gushes as a fountain in the heart of youth. Such an atmosphere could not incite in him the cravings of a boy of 18, but in so far as they were excited, the lack of hope made them proportionately bitter. He could not fail to notice the signs of affluence and luxury on every hand. He had been to New York before and knew the resources of its folly. In part, it was an awesome place to him, for here gathered all that he most respected on this earth: wealth, place, and fame. The majority of the celebrities with whom he tipped glasses in his day as manager hailed from this self-centered and populous spot. The most inviting stories of pleasure and luxury had been told of places and individuals here. He knew it to be true that unconsciously he was brushing elbows with fortune the livelong day, that 100 or 500,000 gave no one the privilege of living more than comfortably in so wealthy a place. Fashion and pomp required more ample sums, so that the poor man was nowhere. All this he realized now quite sharply as he faced the city, cut off from his friends, despoiled of his modest fortune and even his name, and forced to begin the battle for place and comfort all over again. He was not old, but he was not so dull that he could feel he soon would be. Of a sudden, then, the show of fine clothes, place, and power took on peculiar significance. It was emphasized by contrast with his own distressing state. And it was distressing. He soon found that freedom from fear of arrest was not the sine qua non of his existence. That danger dissolved, the next necessity became the grievous thing. The paltry sum of $1,300 and some odd dollars set against the need of rent, clothing, food, and pleasure for years to come was a spectacle little calculated to induce peace of mind in one who had been accustomed to spend 5 times that sum in the course of a year. He thought upon the subject rather actively the first few days he was in New York, and decided that he must act quickly. As a consequence, he consulted the business opportunities advertised in the morning papers and began investigations on his own account. That was not before he had become settled, however. Carrie and he went looking for a flat, as arranged, and found one in 78th Street near Amsterdam Avenue. It was a 5-story building, and their flat was on the 3rd floor. Owing to the fact that the street was not yet built up solidly, it was possible to see east to the green tops of the trees in Central Park, and west to the broad waters of the Hudson, a glimpse of which was to be had out of the west windows. For the privilege of 6 rooms and a bath, running in a straight line, they were compelled to pay $35 a month, an average and yet exorbitant rent for a home at the time. Carrie noticed the difference between the size of the rooms here and in Chicago and mentioned it. "You'll not find anything better, dear," said Hurstwood, "unless you go into one of the old-fashioned houses, and then you won't have any of these conveniences." Carrie picked out the new abode because of its newness and bright woodwork. It was one of the very new ones supplied with steam heat, which was a great advantage. The stationary range, hot and cold water, dumbwaiter, speaking tubes, and call bell for the janitor pleased her very much. She had enough of the instincts of a housewife to take great satisfaction in these things. Hurstwood made arrangement with one of the installment houses whereby they furnished the flat complete and accepted $50 down and $10 a month. He then had a little plate bearing the name G.W. Wheeler made, which he placed on his letterbox in the hall. It sounded exceedingly odd to Carrie to be called Mrs. Wheeler by the janitor, but in time she became used to it and looked upon the name as her own. These house details settled, Hurstwood visited some of the advertised opportunities to purchase an interest in some flourishing downtown bar. After the palatial resort in Adams Street, he could not stomach the commonplace saloons which he found advertised. He lost a number of days looking up these and finding them disagreeable. He did, however, gain considerable knowledge by talking, for he discovered the influence of Tammany Hall and the value of standing in with the police. The most profitable and flourishing places he found to be those which conducted anything but a legitimate business, such as that controlled by Fitzgerald and Moy. Elegant back rooms and private drinking booths on the 2nd floor were usually adjuncts of very profitable places. He saw by portly keepers, whose shirt fronts shone with large diamonds, and whose clothes were properly cut, that the liquor business was here, as elsewhere, yielded the same golden profit. At last he found an individual who had a resort in Warren Street, which seemed an excellent venture. It was fairly well appearing and susceptible of improvement. The owner claimed the business to be excellent, and it certainly looked so. "We deal with a very good class of people," he told Hurstwood. "Merchants, salesmen, and professionals. It's a well-dressed class. No bums. We don't allow 'em in this place." Hurstwood listened to the cash register ring and watched the trade for a while. "It's profitable enough for 2, is it?" he asked. "You can see for yourself if you're any judge of the liquor trade," said the owner. This is only one of the 2 places I have. The other is down in Nassau Street. I can't tend to I can't tend to them both alone. If I had someone who knew the business thoroughly, I wouldn't mind sharing with him in this one and letting him manage it. I've had experience enough, said Hurstwood blandly, but he felt a little different. He felt a little diffident about referring to Fitzgerald and Moy. Well, you can suit yourself, Mr. Wheeler, said the proprietor. He only offered a third interest in the stock, fixtures, and goodwill, and this in return for $1,000 and managerial ability on the part of the one who should come in. There was no property involved because the owner of the saloon merely rented from an estate. The offer was genuine enough to question with Hurstwood whether a third interest in that locality could be made to yield $150 a month, which he figured he must have in order to meet the ordinary family expenses and be comfortable. It was not the time, however, after many failures to find what he wanted, to hesitate. It looked as though a third would pay $100 a month now. By judicious management and improvement, it might be made to pay more. Accordingly, he agreed to enter into partnership and made over his $1,000, preparing to enter the next day. His first inclination was to be elated, and he confided to Carrie that he thought he had made an excellent arrangement. Time, however, introduced food for reflection. He found his partner to be very disagreeable. Frequently, he was the worse for liquor, which made him surly. This was the last thing which Hurstwood was used to in business. Besides, the business varied. It was nothing like the class of patronage which he had enjoyed in Chicago. He found that it would take a long time to make friends. These people hurried in and out without seeking the pleasures of friendship. It was no gathering or lounging place. Whole days and weeks passed without one such hearty greeting as he had been wont to enjoy every day in Chicago. For another thing, Hurstwood missed the celebrities, those well-dressed elite individuals who lend grace to the average bars and bring news from far-off and exclusive circles. He did not see one such in a month. Evenings, when still at his post, he would occasionally read in the evening papers incidents concerning celebrities whom he knew, whom he had drunk a glass with many a time. They would visit a bar like Fitzgerald and Moy's in Chicago or the Hoffman House uptown, but he knew that he would never see them down here. Again, the business did not pay as well as he thought. It increased a little, but he found he would have to watch his household expenses, which was humiliating. In the very beginning, it was a delight to go home late at night as he did and find Carrie. He managed to run up and take dinner with her between 6 and 7, and to remain home until 9 o'clock in the morning. But the novelty of this waned after a time, and he began to feel the drag of his duties. The first month had scarcely passed before Carrie said in a very natural way, "I think I'll go down this week and buy a dress." "What kind?" said Hurstwood. "Oh, something for streetwear." "All right," he answered, smiling, although he noted mentally that it would be more agreeable to his finances if she didn't. Nothing was said about it the next day, but the following morning he asked, "Have you done anything about your dress?" "Not yet," said Carrie. He paused a few moments as if in thought, then said, "Would you mind putting it off a few days?" "No," replied Carrie, who did not catch the drift of his remarks. She had never thought of him in connection with money troubles before. "Why?" "Well, I'll tell you," said Hurstwood. "This investment of mine is taking a lot of money just now. I expect to get it all back shortly, but just at present I am running close." "Oh," answered Carrie. "Why, certainly, dear. Why didn't you tell me before?" "It wasn't necessary," said Hurstwood. For all her acquiescence, there was something about the way Hurstwood spoke which reminded Carrie of Drouet and his little deal which he was always about to put through. It was only the thought of a second, but it was a beginning. It was something new in her thinking of Hurstwood. Other things followed from time to time. Little things of the same sort, which in their cumulative effect were eventually equal to a full revelation. Carrie was not dull by any means. Two persons cannot long dwell together without coming to an understanding of one another. The mental difficulties of an individual reveal themselves whether he voluntarily confesses them or not. Trouble gets in the air and contributes gloom, which speaks for itself. Hurstwood dressed as nicely as usual, but they were the same clothes he had in Canada. Carrie noticed that he did not install a large wardrobe, though his own was anything but large. She noticed also that he did not suggest many amusements, said nothing about the food, seemed concerned about his business. This was not the easy Hurstwood of Chicago, not the liberal, opulent Hurstwood she had known. The change was too obvious to escape detection. In time, she began to feel that a change had come about and that she was not in his confidence. He was evidently secretive and kept his own counsel. She found herself asking him questions about little things. This is a disagreeable state to a woman. Great love makes it seem reasonable, sometimes plausible, but never satisfactory. Where great love is not, a more definite and less satisfactory conclusion is reached. As for Hurstwood, he was making a great fight against the difficulties of a changed condition. He was too shrewd not to realize the tremendous mistake he had made and appreciate that he had done well in getting where he was, and yet he could not help contrasting his present state with his former, hour after hour and day after day. Besides, he had the disagreeable fear of meeting old-time friends, ever since one such encounter which he made shortly after his arrival in the city. It was in Broadway that he saw a man approaching him whom he knew. There was no time for simulating non-recognition. The exchange of glances had been too sharp, the knowledge of each other too apparent. So the friend, a buyer for one of the Chicago wholesale houses, felt, perforce, the necessity of stopping. "How are you?" he said, extending his hand with an evident mixture of feeling and a lack of plausible interest. "Very well," said Hurstwood, equally embarrassed. "How is it with you?" "All right. I'm down here doing a little buying. Are you located here now?" "Yes," said Hurstwood. "I have a place down in Warren Street." "Is that so?" said the friend. "Glad to hear it. I'll come down and see you." "Do," said Hurstwood. "So long," said the other, smiling affably and going on. "You never asked for my number," thought Hurstwood. He wouldn't think of coming. He wiped his forehead, which had grown damp, and hoped sincerely he would meet no one else. These things told upon his good nature, such as it was. His one hope was that things would change for the better in a money way. He had Carrie. His furniture was being paid for. He was maintaining his position. As for Carrie, the amusements he could give her would have to do for the present. He could probably keep up his pretensions sufficiently long without exposure to make good, and then all would be well. He failed therein to take account of the frailties of human nature, the difficulties of matrimonial life. Carrie was young. With him and with her varying mental states were common. At any moment, the extremes of feeling might be anti-polarized at the dinner table. This often happens in the best regulated families. Little things brought out on such occasions need great love to obliterate them afterward. Where that is not, both parties could count 2 and 2 and make a problem after a while. Chapter 31. A Pet of Good Fortune, Broadway flaunts its joys. The effect of the city and situation on Hurstwood was paralleled in the case of Carrie, who accepted the things fortune provided with the most genial good nature. New York, despite her first expression of disapproval, soon interested her exceedingly. Its clear atmosphere, more populous thoroughfares, and peculiar indifference struck her forcibly. She had never seen such a little flat as hers, and yet it soon enlisted her affection. The new furniture made an excellent showing. The sideboard which Hurstwood himself arranged gleamed brightly. The furniture for each room was appropriate, and in the so-called parlor or front room was installed a piano. because Carrie said she would like to learn to play. She kept a servant and developed rapidly in household tactics and information. For the first time in her life, she felt settled and somewhat justified in the eyes of society as she conceived of it. Her thoughts were merry and innocent enough. For a long while, she concerned herself over the arrangement of New York flats and wondered at 10 families living in one building and all remaining strange and indifferent to each other. She also marveled at the whistles of the hundreds of vessels in the harbor, the long, low cries of the sound steamers and ferry boats when the fog was on. The mere fact that these things spoke from the sea made them wonderful. She looked much at what she could see of the Hudson from her west windows and of the great city building up rapidly on either hand. It was much to ponder over and sufficed to entertain her for more than a year without becoming stale. For another thing, Hurstwood was exceedingly interesting in his affection for her. Troubled as he was, he never exposed his difficulties to her. He carried himself with the same self-important air, took his new state with easy familiarity, and rejoiced in Carrie's proclivities and successes. Each evening he arrived promptly to dinner and found the little dressing room a most inviting spectacle. In a way, the smallness of the room added to its luxury. It looked full and replete. The white-covered table was arrayed with pretty dishes and lighted with a four-armed candelabra, each light of which was topped with a red shade. Between Carrie and the girl, the steaks and chops came out all right, and canned goods did the rest for a while. Carrie studied the art of making biscuit and soon reached the stage where she could show a plate of light, palatable morsels for her labor. In this manner the second, third, and fourth months passed. Winter came, and with it a feeling that indoors was best, so that the attending of theaters was not much talked of. Hurstwood made great efforts to meet all expenditures without a show of feeling one way or the other. He pretended that he was reinvesting his money in strengthening the business for greater ends in the future. He contented himself with a very moderate allowance of personal apparel and rarely suggested anything for Carrie. Thus, the first winter passed. In the second year, the business which Hurstwood managed did increase somewhat. He got out of it regularly the 150 per month which he had anticipated. Unfortunately, by this time, Carrie had reached certain conclusions, and he had scraped up a few acquaintances. Being of a passive and receptive rather than an active and aggressive nature, Carrie accepted the situation. Her state seemed satisfactory enough. Once in a while they would go to a theater together, occasionally in season to the beaches in different points about the city, but they picked up no acquaintances. Hurstwood naturally abandoned his show of fine manners with her and modified his attitude to one of easy familiarity. There were no misunderstandings, no apparent differences of opinion. In fact, without money or visiting friends, he led a life which could neither arouse jealousy nor comment. Carrie rather sympathized with his efforts and thought nothing upon her lack of entertainment, such as she had enjoyed in Chicago. New York, as a corporate entity, and her flat temporarily seemed sufficient. However, as Hurstwood's business increased, he, as stated, began to pick up acquaintances. He also began to allow himself more clothes. He convinced himself that his home life was very precious to him, but allowed that he could occasionally stay away from dinner. The first time he did this, he sent a message saying that he would be detained. Carrie ate alone and wished that it might not happen again. The second time, also, he sent word, but at the last moment. The third time, he forgot entirely and explained afterwards. These events were months apart, each. "Where were you, George?" asked Carrie, after the first absence. "Tied up at the office," he said genially. There were some accounts I had to straighten." "I'm sorry you couldn't get home," she said kindly. "I was fixing to have such a nice dinner." The second time he gave a similar excuse, but the third time, the feeling about it in Carrie's mind was a bit out of the ordinary. I couldn't get home, he said, when he came in later in the evening. I was so busy. Couldn't you have sent me word? Asked Carrie. I meant to, he said, but I forgot it until it was too late to do any good. And I had such a good dinner, said Carrie. Now it so happened that from his observations of Carrie he began to imagine that she was of the thoroughly domestic type of mind. He really thought after a year that her chief expression in life was finding its natural channel in household duties. Notwithstanding the fact that he had observed her act in Chicago, and that during the past year he had only seen her limited in her relations to her flat, and him by conditions which he made, and that she had not gained any friends or associates. He drew this peculiar conclusion. With it came a feeling of satisfaction in having a wife who could thus be content, and this satisfaction worked its natural result. That is, since he imagined he saw her satisfied, he felt called upon to give only that which contributed to such satisfaction. He supplied the furniture, the decorations, the food, and the necessary clothing. Thoughts of entertaining her, leading her out into the shine and show of life, grew less and less. He felt attracted to the outer world, but did not think she would care to go along. Once he went to the theater alone. Another time he joined a couple of his new friends at an evening game of poker. Since his money feathers were beginning to grow again, he felt like sprucing about. All this, however, in a much less imposing way than had been his wont in Chicago. He avoided the gay places where he would be apt to meet those who had known him. Now, Carrie began to feel this in various sensory ways. She was not the kind to be seriously disturbed by his actions. Not loving him greatly, she could not be jealous in a disturbing way. In fact, she was not jealous at all. Hurstwood was pleased with her placid manner, when he should have duly considered it. When he did not come home, it did not seem anything like a terrible thing to her. She gave him credit for having the usual allurements of men. People to talk to, places to stop, friends to consult with. She was perfectly willing that he should enjoy himself in his way, but she did not care to be neglected herself. Her state still seemed fairly reasonable, however. All she did observe was that Hurstwood was somewhat different. Some time in the second year of their residence in 78th Street, the flat across the hall from Carrie became vacant, and into it moved a very handsome young woman and her husband, with both of whom Carrie afterwards became acquainted. This was brought about solely by the arrangement of the flats, which were united in one place, as it were, by the dumbwaiter. This useful elevator, by which fuel, groceries, and the like were sent up from the basement, and garbage and waste sent down, was used by both residents on one floor. That is, a small door opened into it from each flat. If the occupants of both flats answered to the whistle of the janitor at the same time, they would stand face to face when they opened the dumbwaiter doors. One morning, when Carrie went to remove her paper, the newcomer, a handsome brunette of perhaps 23 years of age, was there for a like purpose. She was in a night robe and dressing gown, with her hair very much tousled, but she looked so pretty and good-natured that Carrie instantly conceived a liking for her. The newcomer did no more than smile shamefacedly, but it was sufficient. Carrie felt that she would like to know her, and a similar feeling stirred in the mind of the other, who admired Carrie's innocent face. "Who are they?" asked Hurstwood. "I don't know," said Carrie. "The name on the bell is Vance. Someone over there plays beautifully. I guess it must be she." "Well, you never can tell what sort of people you're living next to in this town, can you?" said Hurstwood, expressing the customary New York opinion about neighbors. "Just think," said Carrie. "I have been in this house with 9 other families for over a year, and I don't know a soul. These people have been here over a month, and I haven't seen anyone before this morning." "It's just as well," said Hurstwood. "You never know who you're going to get in with. Some of these people are pretty bad company." "I expect so," said Carrie agreeably. The conversation turned to other things, and Carrie thought no more upon the subject until a day or two later, when going out to the market, she encountered Mrs. Vance coming in. The latter recognized her and nodded, for which Carrie returned a smile. This settled the probability of acquaintanceship. If there had been no faint recognition on this occasion, there would have been no future association. Carrie saw no more of Mrs. Vance for several weeks, but she heard her play through the thin walls which divided the front rooms of the flats, and was pleased by the merry selection of pieces and the brilliance of their rendition. She could play only moderately herself, and such variety as Mrs. Vance exercised bordered, for Carrie, upon the verge of great art. Everything she had seen and heard thus far, the merest scraps and shadows, indicated that these people were, in a measure, refined and in comfortable circumstances. So Carrie was ready for any extension of the friendship which might follow. One day, Carrie's bell rang, and the servant, who was in the kitchen, pressed the button which caused the front door of the general entrance on the ground floor to be electrically unlatched. When Carrie waited at her own door on the third floor to see who it might be coming up to call on her, Mrs. Vance appeared. "I hope you'll excuse me," she said. "I went out a while ago and forgot my outside key, so I thought I'd ring your bell." This was a common trick of other residents of the building, whenever they had forgotten their outside keys. They did not apologize for it, however. "Certainly," said Carrie. "I'm glad you did. I do the same thing sometimes." "Isn't it just delightful weather?" said Mrs. Vance, pausing for a moment. Thus, after a few more preliminaries, this visiting acquaintance was well launched, and in the young Mrs. Vance, Carrie found an agreeable companion. On several occasions, Carrie visited her and was visited. Both flats were good to look upon, though that of the Vances tended somewhat more to the luxurious. "I want you to come over this evening and meet my husband," said Mrs. Vance, not long after their intimacy began. "He wants to meet you. You play cards, don't you?" "A little," said Carrie. "Well, we'll have a game of cards. If your husband comes home, bring him over." "He's not coming to dinner tonight," said Carrie. "Well, when he does come, we'll call him in." Carrie acquiesced, and that evening met the portly Vance, a few years younger than Hurstwood, and who owed his seemingly comfortable matrimonial state much more to his money than to his good looks. He thought well of Carrie upon the first glance, and laid himself out to be genial, teaching her a new game of cards and talking to her about New York and its pleasures. Mrs. Vance played it some upon the piano, and at last Hurstwood came. "I'm very glad to meet you," he said to Mrs. Vance when Carrie introduced him, showing much of the old grace which had captivated Carrie. "Did you think your wife had run away?" said Mr. Vance, extending his hand upon introduction. I didn't know, but what she might have found a better husband," said Hurstwood. He now turned his attention to Mrs. Vance, and in a flash, Carrie saw again what she for some time had subconsciously missed in Hurstwood, the adroitness and flattery of which he was capable. She also saw that she was not well dressed, not nearly as well dressed as Mrs. Vance. These were not vague ideas any longer. Her situation was cleared up for her. She felt that her life was becoming stale, and therein she felt cause for gloom. The old helpful urging melancholy was restored. The desirous Carrie was whispered to concerning her possibilities. There were no immediate results to this awakening, for Carrie had little power of initiative, but nevertheless she seemed ever capable of getting herself into the tide of change where she would be easily borne along. Hurstwood noticed nothing, He had been unconscious of the marked contrasts which Carrie had observed. He did not even detect the shade of melancholy which settled in her eyes. Worst of all, she now began to feel the loneliness of the flat and seek the company of Mrs. Vance, who liked her exceedingly. "Let's go to the matinee this afternoon," said Mrs. Vance, who had stepped across into Carrie's flat one morning, still arrayed in a soft pink dressing gown, which she had donned upon rising. Hurstwood and Vance had gone their separate which she had donned upon rising. Hurstwood and Vance had gone their separate ways nearly an hour before. "All right," said Carrie, noticing the air of the petted and well-groomed woman in Mrs. Vance's general appearance. She looked as though she was dearly loved, and her every wish gratified. "What shall we see?" "Oh, I do want to see Nat Goodwin," said Mrs. Vance. "I do think he is the jolliest actor. The papers say this is such a good play." "What time will we have to start?" asked Carrie. "Let's go at 1 and walk down Broadway from 34th Street," said Mrs. Vance. "It's such an interesting walk. He's at the Madison Square." "I'll be glad to go," said Carrie. "How much will we have to pay for seats?" "Not more than $1," said Mrs. Vance. The latter departed, and at 1 o'clock reappeared, stunningly arrayed in a dark blue walking dress, with a knobby hat to match. Carrie had gotten herself up charmingly enough, but this woman pained her by contrast. She seemed to have so many dainty little things which Carrie had not. There were trinkets of gold, an elegant green leather purse with her initials, a fancy handkerchief, exceedingly rich in design, and the like. Carrie felt that she needed more and better clothes to compare with this woman, and that anyone looking at the two would pick Mrs. Vance for her raiment alone. It was a trying, though rather unjust thought, for Carrie had now developed an equally pleasing figure and had grown in comeliness until she was a thoroughly attractive type of her color of beauty. There was some difference in the clothing of the two, both of quality and age, but this difference was not especially noticeable. It served, however, to augment Carrie's dissatisfaction with her state. The walk down Broadway, then as now, was one of the remarkable features of the city. There gathered before the matinee and afterwards not only all the pretty women who love a showy parade, but the men who love to gaze upon and admire them. It was a very imposing procession of pretty faces in fine clothes. Women appeared in their very best hats, shoes, and gloves, and walked arm in arm on their way to the fine shops or theaters strung along from 14th to 34th Streets. Equally, the men paraded with the very latest they could afford. A tailor might have secured hints on suit measurements, a shoemaker on proper lasts and colors, a hatter on hats. It was literally true that if a lover of fine clothes secured a new suit, it was sure to have its first airing on Broadway. So true and well understood was this fact that several years later a popular song, detailing this and other facts concerning the afternoon parade on matinee days, and entitled "What Right Has He on Broadway," was published, and had quite a vogue about the music halls of the city. In all her stay in the city, Carrie had never heard of this showy parade, had never ever been on Broadway when it was taking place. On the other hand, it was a familiar thing to Mrs. Vance, who not only knew of it as an entity, but had often been in it, going purposely to see and be to create a stir with her beauty and dispel any tendency to fall short in dressiness by contrasting herself with the beauty and fashion of the town. Carrie stepped along easily enough after they got out of the car at 34th Street, but soon fixed her eyes upon the lovely company which swarmed by and with them as they proceeded. She noticed suddenly that Mrs. Vance's manner had rather stiffened under the gaze of handsome men and elegantly dressed ladies, whose glances were not modified by any rules of propriety. To stare seemed the proper and natural thing. Carrie found herself stared at and ogled, Men in flawless topcoats, high hats, and silver-headed walking sticks elbowed near and looked too often into conscious eyes. Ladies rustled by in dresses of stiff cloth, shredding affected smiles and perfume. Carrie noticed among them the sprinkling of goodness and the heavy percentage of vice. The rouged and powdered cheeks and lips, the scented hair, the large, misty, and languorous eye were common enough. With a start, she awoke to find that she was in fashion's crowd, on parade in a showplace. And such a showplace! Jewelers' windows gleamed along the path with remarkable frequency. Florist shops, furriers, haberdashers, confectioners, all followed in rapid succession. The street was full of coaches. Pompous doormen in immense coats, shiny brass belts and buttons, waited in front of expensive sales rooms. Coachmen in tan boots, white tights, and blue jackets waited obsequiously for the mistresses of carriages who were shopping inside. The whole street bore the flavor of riches and show, and Carrie felt that she was not of it. She could not, for the life of her, assume the attitude and smartness of Mrs. Vance, who in her beauty was all assurance. She could only imagine that it must be evident to many that she was the less handsomely dressed of the two. It cut her to the quick, and she resolved that she would not come here again until she looked better. At the same time, she longed to feel the delight of parading here as an equal. Ah, then she would be happy. Chapter 32. The Feast of Belshazzar, a seer to translate. Such feelings as were generated in Carrie by this walk put her in an exceedingly receptive mood for the pathos which followed in the play. The actor whom they had gone to see had achieved his popularity by presenting a mellow type of comedy, in which sufficient sorrow was introduced to lend contrast and relief to humor. For Carrie, as we well know, the stage had a great attraction. She had never forgotten her one histrionic achievement in Chicago. It dwelt in her mind and occupied her consciousness during many long afternoons in which her rocking chair and her latest novel contributed the only pleasures of her state. Never could she witness a play without having her own ability vividly brought to consciousness. Some scenes made her long to be a part of them, to give expression to the feelings which she, in the place of the character represented, would feel. Almost invariably, she would carry the vivid imaginations away with her and brood over them the next day alone. She lived as much in these things as in the realities which made up her daily life. It was not often that she came to the play stirred to her heart's core by actualities. Today, a low song of longing had been set singing in her heart by the finery, the merriment, the beauty she had seen. Oh, these women who had passed her by, hundreds and hundreds strong. Who were they? Whence came the rich, elegant dresses, the astonishingly colored buttons, the knickknacks of silver and gold? Where were these lovely creatures housed? Amid what elegancies of carved furniture, decorated walls, elaborate tapestries did they move? Where were their rich apartments, loaded with all that money could provide? In what stables champed these sleek, nervous horses and rested the gorgeous carriages? Where lounged the richly groomed footmen? Oh, the mansions, the lights, the perfume, the loaded boudoirs and tables. New York must be filled with such bowers, or the beautiful, insolent, supercilious creatures could not be. Some hot houses held them. It ached her to know that she was not one of them. That, alas, she had dreamed a dream, and it had not come true. She wondered at her own solitude these 2 years past, her indifference to the fact that she had never achieved what she had expected. The play was one of those drawing-room concoctions in which charmingly overdressed ladies and gentlemen suffered the pangs of love and jealousy amid gilded surroundings. Such bon mots are ever enticing to those who have all their days longed for such material surroundings, and have never had them gratified. They have the charm of showing suffering under ideal conditions. Who would not grieve upon a gilded chair? Who would not suffer amid perfumed tapestries, cushioned furniture, and liveried servants? Grief under such circumstances becomes an enticing thing. Carrie longed to be of it. She wanted to take her sufferings, whatever they were, in such a world, or failing that, at least to simulate them under such charming conditions upon the stage. So affected was her mind by what she had seen that the play now seemed an extraordinary, beautiful thing. She was soon lost in the world it represented and wished that she might never return. Between the acts, she studied the galaxy of matinee attendants in front rows and boxes, and conceived a new idea of the possibilities of New York. She was sure she had not seen it all, that the city was one whirl of pleasure and delight. Going out, the same Broadway taught her a sharper lesson. The scene she had witnessed coming down was now augmented and at its height. Such a crush of finery and folly she had never seen. It clinched her convictions concerning her state. She had not lived, could not lay claim to having until something of this had come into her own life. Women were spending money like water. She could see that in every elegant shop she passed. Flowers, candy, jewelry seemed the principal things in which the elegant dames were interested. And she had scarcely enough pin money to indulge in such outings as this a few times a month. That night, the pretty little flat seemed a commonplace thing. It was not what the rest of the world was enjoying. She saw the servant working at dinner with an indifferent eye. In her mind were running scenes of the play. Particularly, she remembered one beautiful actress, the sweetheart who had been wooed and won. The grace of this woman had won Carrie's heart. Her dresses had been all that art could suggest. Her sufferings had been so real. The anguish which she had portrayed Carrie could feel. It was done as she was sure she could do it. There were places in which she could even do better. Hence, she repeated the lines to herself. Oh, she could only have such a part. How broad would be her life. She, too, could act appealingly. When Hurstwood came, Carrie was moody. She was sitting, rocking, and thinking, and did not care to have her enticing imaginations broken in upon. So she said little or nothing. "What's the matter, Carrie?" said Hurstwood after a time, noticing her quiet, almost moody state. "Nothing," said Carrie. "I don't feel very well tonight." "Not sick, are you?" he asked, approaching very close. "Oh, no," she said almost pettishly. "I just don't feel very good." "That's too bad," he said, stepping away and adjusting his vest after his slight bending over. "I was thinking we might go to a show tonight." "I don't want to go," said Carrie, annoyed that her fine visions should have thus been broken into and driven out of her mind. "I've been to a matinee this afternoon." "Oh, you have?" said Hurstwood. "What was it?" "A gold mine." "How was it?" "Pretty good," said Carrie. "And you don't want to go again tonight?" "I don't think I do," she said. Nevertheless, wakened out of her melancholia and called to the dinner table, she changed her mind. A little food in the stomach does wonders. She went again, and in so doing temporarily recovered her equanimity. The great awakening blow had, however, been delivered. As often as she might recover from these discontented thoughts now, they would occur again. Time and repetition. Ah, the wonder of it. The dropping water and the solid stone, how utterly it yields at last. Not long after this matinee experience, perhaps a month, Mrs. Vance invited Carrie to an evening at the theater with them. She heard Carrie say that Hurstwood was not coming home to dinner. "Why don't you come with us?" "Don't get dinner for yourself. We're going down to Sherry's for dinner, and then over to the Lyceum. Come along with us." "I think I will," answered Carrie. She began to dress at 3 o'clock for her departure at 5:30 for the noted dining room, which was then crowding Delmonico's for position in society. In this dressing, Carrie showed the influence of her association with the dashing Mrs. Vance. She had constantly had her attention called by the latter to novelties in everything which pertains to a woman's apparel. "Are you going to get such and such a hat?" or "Have you seen the new gloves with the oval pearl buttons?" were but sample phrases out of a large selection. "The next time you get a pair of shoes, dearie," said Mrs. Vance, "get button, with thick soles and patent leather tips. They're all the rage this fall." "I will," said Carrie. "Oh dear, have you seen the new shirtwaist at Altman's? They have some of the loveliest patterns. I saw one there that I know I would look stunning on you. I said so when I saw it." Carrie listened to these things with considerable interest, for they were suggested with more friendliness than is usually common between pretty women. Mrs. Vance liked Carrie's stable good nature so well that she really took pleasure in suggesting to her the latest things. "Why don't you get yourself one of those nice serge skirts they're selling at Lord & Taylor's?" she said one day. "They're the circular style, and they're going to be worn from now on. A dark blue one would look so nice on you." Carrie listened with good ears. These things never came up between her and Hurstwood. Nevertheless, she began to suggest one thing and another which Hurstwood agreed to without any expression of opinion. He noticed the new tendency on Carrie's part, and finally, hearing much of Mrs. Vance and her delightful ways, suspected whence the change came. He was not inclined to offer the slightest objection so soon, but he felt that Carrie's wants were expanding. This did not appeal to him exactly, but he cared for her in his own way, and so the thing stood. Still, there was something in the details of the transactions which caused Carrie to feel that her requests were not a delight to him. He did not enthuse over the purchases. This led her to believe that neglect was creeping in, and so another small wedge was entered. Nevertheless, one of the results of Mrs. Vance's suggestions was the fact that on this occasion, Carrie was dressed somewhat to her own satisfaction. She had on her best, but there was a comfort in the thought that if she must confine herself to a best, it was neat and fitting. She looked the well-groomed woman of 21, and Mrs. Vance praised her, which brought color to her plump cheeks and a noticeable brightness into her large eyes. It was threatening rain, and Mr. Vance, at his wife's request, had called a coach. "Your husband isn't coming," suggested Mrs. Vance, as he met Carrie in his little parlor. "No, he said he wouldn't be home for dinner." "Better leave a little note for him, telling him where we are. He might turn up." "I will," said Carrie, who had not thought of it before. "Tell him we'll be at Sherry's until 8 o'clock. He knows, though, I guess." Carrie crossed the hall with rustling skirts and scrawled the note, gloves on. When she returned, a newcomer was in the Vance flat. "Mrs. Wheeler, let me introduce Mr. Ames, a cousin of mine," said Mrs. Vance. "He's going along with us, aren't you, Bob?" "I'm very glad to meet you," said Ames, bowing politely to Carrie. The latter caught in a glance the dimensions of a very stalwart figure. She also noticed that he was smooth-shaven, good-looking, and young, but nothing more. "Mr. Ames is just down in New York for a few days," put in Vance, "and we're trying to show him around a little." "Oh, are you?" said Carrie, taking another glance at the newcomer. "Yes, I am just on here from Indianapolis for a week or so," said young Ames, seating himself on the edge of a chair to wait while Mrs. Vance completed the last touches of her toilet. "I guess you find New York quite a thing to see, don't you?" said Carrie, venturing something to avoid a possible deadly silence. "It is rather large to get around in a week," answered Ames pleasantly. He was an exceedingly genial soul, this young man, and wholly free of affectation. It seemed to Carrie he was as yet only overcoming the last traces of the bashfulness of youth. He did not seem apt at conversation, but he had the merit of being well dressed and wholly courageous. Carrie felt as if it were not going to be hard to talk to him. "Well, I guess we're ready now. The coach is outside." "Come on, people," said Mrs. Vance, coming in smiling. "Bob, you'll have to look after Mrs. Wheeler." "I'll try to," said Bob, smiling and edging closer to Carrie. "You won't need much watching, will you?" he volunteered, in a sort of ingratiating and help-me-out kind of way. "Not very, I hope," said Carrie. They descended the stairs, Mrs. Vance offering suggestions, and climbed into the open coach. "All right," said Vance, slamming the coach door, and the conveyance rolled away. "What is it we're going to see?" asked Ames. "Southern," said Vance, "and Lord Chumley." "Oh, he is so good," said Mrs. Vance. He's just the funniest man." "I noticed the papers praise it," said Ames. "I haven't any doubt," put in Vance, "but we'll all enjoy it very much." Ames had taken his seat beside Carrie, and accordingly he felt it his bounden duty to pay her some attention. He was interested to find her so young a wife and so pretty, though it was only a respectful interest. There was nothing of the dashing lady's man about him. He had respect for the married state and thought only of some pretty marriageable girls in Indianapolis. "Are you a born New Yorker?" asked Ames of Carrie. "Oh, no, I've only been here for 2 years." "Oh, well, you've had time to see a great deal of it, anyhow." "I don't seem to have," answered Carrie. "It's about as strange to me as when I first came here." "You're not from the West, are you?" "Yes, I'm from Wisconsin," she answered. "Well, it does seem as if most people in this town haven't been here so very long. I hear of lots of Indiana people in my line who are here." "What is your line?" asked Carrie. "I'm connected with an electrical company," said the youth. Carrie followed up this desultory conversation with occasional interruptions from the Vances. Several times it became general and partially humorous, and in that manner the restaurant was reached. Carrie had noticed the appearance of gaiety and pleasure-seeking in the streets which they were following. Coaches were numerous, pedestrians many, and in 59th Street the street cars were crowded. At 59th Street and Fifth Avenue, a blaze of lights from several new hotels which bordered the Plaza Square gave a suggestion of sumptuous hotel life. Fifth Avenue, the home of the wealthy, was noticeably crowded with carriages, and gentlemen in evening dress. At Sherry's, an imposing doorman opened the coach door and helped them out. Young Ames held Carrie's elbow as he helped her up the steps. They entered the lobby already swarming with patrons, and then, after divesting themselves of their wraps, went into a sumptuous dining room. In all Carrie's experience, she had never seen anything like this. In the whole time she had been in New York, Hurstwood's modified state, had not permitted his bringing her to such a place. There was an almost indescribable atmosphere about it which convinced the newcomer that this was the proper thing. Here was the place where the matter of expense limited the patrons to the moneyed or pleasure-loving class. Carrie had read of it often in the morning and evening world. She had seen notices of dances, parties, balls, and suppers at Sherry's. The Mrs. So-and-so would give a party on Wednesday evening at Sherry's. Young Mr. So-and-so would entertain a party of friends at a private luncheon on the 16th at Sherry's. The common run of conventional perfunctory notices of the doings of society, which she could scarcely refrain from scanning each day, had given her a distinct idea of the gorgeousness and luxury of this wonderful temple of gastronomy. Now at last she was really in it. She had come up the imposing steps, guarded by the large and portly doorman. She had seen the lobby, guarded by another large and portly gentleman, and been waited by uniformed youths who took care of canes, overcoats, and the like. Here was the splendid dining chamber, all decorated and aglow, where the wealthy ate. How fortunate was Mrs. Vance! Young, beautiful, and well off, at least sufficiently so to come here in a coach. What a wonderful thing it was to be rich! Vance led the way through lanes of shining tables, at which were seated parties of 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. The air of assurance and dignity about it all was exceedingly noticeable to the novitiate. Incandescent lights, the reflection of their glow in polished glasses, and the shine of gilt upon the walls, combined into one tone of light which it requires minutes of complacent observation to separate and take particular note of. The white shirt fronts of the gentlemen, the bright costumes of the ladies, diamonds, jewels, fine feathers, all were exceedingly noticeable. Carrie walked with an air equal to that of Mrs. Vance and accepted the seat which the head waiter provided for her. She was keenly aware of all the little things that were done, the little genuflections and attentions of the waiters and head waiter which Americans pay for. The air with which the latter pulled out each chair and the wave of the hand with which he motioned them to be seated were worth several dollars in themselves. Once seated, there began the exhibition of showy, wasteful, and unwholesome gastronomy as practiced by wealthy Americans, which is the wonder and astonishment of true culture and dignity the world over. The large bill of fare held an array of dishes sufficient to feed an army, side-lined with prices which made reasonable expenditure a ridiculous impossibility. An order of soup at 50 cents or $1, with a dozen kinds to choose from. Oysters in 40 styles and at 60 cents the half dozen. Entrees, fish, and meats at prices which would house one overnight in an average hotel. $1.50 and $2 seemed to be the most common figures upon the most tastefully printed bill of fare. Carrie noticed this, and in scanning it, the price of spring chicken carried her back to that other bill of fare and far different occasion, when, for the first time, she sat with Drouet in a good restaurant in Chicago. It was only momentary, a sad note as out of an old song, and then it was gone. But in that flash was seen the other Carrie, poor, hungry, drifting at her wits' ends, and all Chicago a cold and closed world from which she only wandered because she could not find work. On the walls were designs in color, square spots of robin's egg blue set in ornate frames of gilt, whose corners were elaborate moldings of fruit and flowers, with fat cupids hovering in angelic comfort. On the ceiling were colored traceries with more gilt, leading to a center where spread a cluster of lights, incandescent globes mingled with glittering prisms and stucco tendrils of gilt. The floor was of a reddish hue, waxed and polished, and in every direction were mirrors, tall, brilliant, bevel-edged mirrors, reflecting and re-reflecting forms and faces, and candelabra a score and 100 times. The tables were not so remarkable in themselves, and yet the imprint of Sherry upon the napery, the name of Tiffany upon the silverware, the name of Haviland upon the china, and over all the glow of the small red-shaded candelabra and the reflected tints of the walls on garments and faces made them seem remarkable. Each waiter added an air of exclusiveness and elegance by the manner in which he bowed, scraped, touched, and trifled with things. The exclusively personal attention which he devoted to each one, standing half-bent, ear to one side, elbows akimbo, saying, "Soup? Green turtle, yes. One portion? Yes. Oysters? Certainly. Half dozen? Yes. Asparagus? Olives? Yes." It would be the same with each one, only Vance essayed to order for all, inviting counsel and suggestions. Carrie studied the company with open eyes. So this was high life in New York. It was so that the rich spent their days and evenings. Her poor little mind could not rise above applying each scene to all society. Every fine lady must be in the crowd on Broadway in the afternoon, in the theater at the matinee, in the coaches and dining halls at night. It must be glow and shine everywhere, with coaches waiting and footmen attending. And she was out of it all. In 2 long years, she had never even been in such a place as this. Vance was in his element here, as Hurstwood would have been in former days. He ordered freely of soup, oysters, roast meals, and side dishes, and had several bottles of wine brought, which were set down beside the table in a wicker basket. Ames was looking away rather abstractedly at the crowd, and showed an interesting profile to Carrie. His forehead was high, his nose rather large and strong, his chin moderately pleasing. He had a good, wide, well-shaped mouth, and his dark brown hair was parted slightly on one side. He seemed to have the least touch of boyishness to Carrie, and yet he was a man full grown. "Do you know," he said, turning back to Carrie after his reflection, "I sometimes think it is a shame for people to spend so much money this way." Carrie looked at him a moment with the faintest touch of surprise at his seriousness. He seemed to be thinking about something over which she had never pondered. "Do you?" she answered interestedly. "Yes," he said. "They pay so much more than these things are worth. They put on such a show." "I don't know why people shouldn't spend when they have it," said Mrs. Vance. "It doesn't do any harm," said Vance, who was still studying the bill of fare, though he had ordered. Ames was looking away again, and Carrie was again looking at his forehead. To her, he seemed to be thinking about strange things. As he studied the crowd, his eye was mild. "Look at that woman's dress over there," he said, again turning to Carrie and nodding in a direction. "Where?" said Carrie, following his eyes. "There, in the corner. Way over. Do you see that brooch?" "Isn't it large?" said Carrie. "One of the largest clusters of jewels I have ever seen," said Ames. "It is, isn't it?" said Carrie. She felt as if she would like to be agreeable to this young man, and also there came with it, or perhaps preceded it, the slightest shade of feeling that he was better educated than she was, that his mind was better. He seemed to look it, and the saving grace in Carrie was that she could understand that people could be wiser. She had seen a number of people in her life who reminded her of what she had vaguely come to think of as scholars. The strong young man beside her was his clear, natural look, seemed to get a hold of things which she did not quite understand, but approved of. It was fine to be so, as a man, she thought. The conversation changed to a book that was having its vogue at the time, Molding a Maiden by Albert Ross. Mrs. Vance had read it. Vance had seen it discussed in some of the papers. "A man can make quite a strike writing a book," said Vance. "I notice this fellow Ross is very much talked about." He was looking at Carrie as he spoke. "I hadn't heard of him," said Carrie honestly. "Oh, I have," said Mrs. Vance. "He's written lots of things. This last story is pretty good." "He doesn't amount to much," said Ames. Carrie turned her eyes toward him as to an oracle. "His stuff is nearly as bad as Dora Thorne," concluded Ames. Carrie felt this as a personal reproof. She read Dora Thorne, or had a great deal in the past. It seemed only fair to her, but she supposed that people thought it very fine. Now this clear, fine-headed youth who looked something like a student to her made fun of it. It was poor to him, not worth reading. She looked down and for the first time felt the pain of not understanding. Yet there was nothing sarcastic or supercilious in the way Ames spoke. He had very little of that in him. Carrie felt that it was just kindly thought of a high order, the right thing to think, and wondered what else was right according to him. He seemed to notice that she listened and rather sympathized with him, and from now on he talked mostly to her. As the waiter bowed and scraped about, felt the dishes to see if they were hot enough, brought spoons and forks, and did all those little attentive things calculated to impress the luxury of the situation upon the diner. Ames also leaned slightly to one side and told her of Indianapolis in an intelligent way. He really had a very bright mind, which was finding its chief development in electrical knowledge. His sympathies for other forms of information, however, and for types of people, were quick and warm. The red glow on his head gave it a sandy tinge and put a bright glint in his eye. Carrie noticed all these things as he leaned toward her and felt exceedingly young. This man was far ahead of her. He seemed wiser than Hurstwood, saner and brighter than Drouet. He seemed innocent and clean, and she thought that he was exceedingly pleasant. She noticed also that his interest in her was a far-off one. She was not in his life, nor any of the things that touched his life, and yet, now as he spoke of these things, they appealed to her. "I shouldn't care to be rich," he told her, as the dinner proceeded and the supply of food warmed up to his sympathies. "Not rich enough to spend my money this way." "Oh, wouldn't you?" said Carrie, to her new former attitude, forcing itself distinctly upon her for the first time. "No," he said, "what good would it do? A man doesn't need this sort of thing to be happy." Carrie thought of this doubtfully, but coming from him it had weight with her. He probably could be happy, she thought to herself, all alone. He's so strong. Mr. and Mrs. Vance kept up a running fire of interruptions, and these impressive things by Ames came at odd moments. They were sufficient, however, for the atmosphere that went with this youth impressed itself upon Carrie without words. There was something in him, or the world he moved in, which appealed to her. He reminded her of scenes she had seen on the stage, the sorrows and sacrifices that always went with she knew not what. He had taken away some of the bitterness of the contrast between this life and her life, and all by a certain calm indifference which concerned only him. As they went out, he took her arm and helped her into the coach, and then they were off again, and so to the show. During the acts, Carrie found herself listening to him very attentively. He mentioned things in the play which she most approved of, things which swayed her deeply. "Don't you think it rather fine to be an actor?" she asked once. "Yes, I do," he said, "to be a good one. I think the theater a great thing." Just this little approval set Carrie's heart bounding. She could only be an actress, a good one. This man was wise. He knew, and he approved of it. If she were a fine actress, such men as he would approve of her. She felt that he was good to speak as he had, although it did not concern her at all. She did not know why she felt this way. At the close of the show, it suddenly developed that he was not going back with them. "Oh, aren't you?" said Carrie, with an unwarrantable feeling. "Oh, no," he said, "I'm stopping right around here in 33rd Street. Carrie could not say anything else, but this development shocked her. She had been regretting the wane of a pleasant evening, but she had thought there was a half hour more. Oh, the half hours, the minutes of the world. What miseries and griefs are crowded into them! She said goodbye with feigned indifference. What matter could it make? Still, the coach seemed lorn. When she went into her own flat, she had this to think about. She did not know whether she would ever see this man any more. What difference could it make? What difference could it make? Hurstwood had returned and was already in bed. His clothes were scattered loosely about. Carrie came to the door and saw him and then retreated. She did not want to go in yet a while. She wanted to think. It was disagreeable to her. Back in the dining room, she sat in her chair and rocked. Her little hands were folded tightly as she thought. Through a fog of longing and conflicting desires, she was beginning to see. O ye legions of hope and pity, of sorrow and pain, she was rocking and beginning to see.